I would have been notes.
Well, I think it's close enough to 2 o'clock. I'm going to call the meeting to order. We have present committee members Nancy Olson, Bob Geppert, Ron DePonte, Joe Schofield, Nancy Hall, myself, and John Grega, I think will be joining us on the phone very shortly. I wanted to welcome all the people who are here. I know some of you are here, or quite a number of you are here from Viadana. Several others are here to see the outcome of the selection process for new members. So welcome to all of you. First thing on the agenda is to approve, there are 3 sets of minutes, all of which all of you have had the opportunity to see and read. Are there any, let's start with the May 14th minutes. We got behind the 8 ball. Hopefully this should catch us up, assuming now we're going to get minutes taken today. May 14th minutes, any additions or corrections? If not, I'll entertain a motion to approve those minutes as approved.
I'll second.
Approved, motion by Ron, and second by Bob. All in favor?
Aye.
Passes unanimously. July 17th minutes. Any changes to those? If not, again, I will take a motion. So moved by Nancy.
I'll second.
Second by Bob Geppert. All in favor?
Aye.
Those pass. Okay. And finally, August 8th minutes. Again, any additions or corrections?
Hello, this is John Grega.
Hello, John Grega. We're in the middle of approving the August 8th. You missed 2 sets of minutes. Very important.
Oh, you guys started early.
Yeah.
And my clock is wrong. I'm
Okay.
sorry.
Your clock's wrong. Well, you're pretty good. You're pretty good.
All right.
So, motion to approve the August 8th minutes.
I make a motion.
Bob Geppert moves, Nancy Olson seconds. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
As I said.
I abstained.
You abstained, you weren't there.
I wasn't there.
All right. We had 1 abstention, Ron DePonte. Finally, thank you to Nancy and Paul for helping us catch up on this minute situation. Hopefully now we'll have a better process for doing the minutes so we don't get so far behind. We put right up at the front of the agenda Lake 38 improvements because this is of interest to a lot of the people here. So I'm going to ask Bob Geppert to kind of introduce it, but I should also mention that Tyler Wainwright from our engineers is here also to support this discussion. So Bob, if you'll.
Hey, by way of background for anybody that's not familiar with the issue.
Yeah.
Can I interrupt for a second?
Sure, John.
Being I was late calling in, do you guys have to vote for me to?
Thank you for reminding me. Let's go to that. Can I have a motion to allow John to participate in the meeting?
So moved that John can participate.
Okay,
I'll second.
And Joe makes the motion. Ron seconds. All in favor?
Aye.
Now you're a real person, John. You're a real person.
Thank you.
Everybody can hear you, John.
That's right. Okay, Bob, go ahead.
Okay. In the summer of 2018, we had 2 major storm events, one of which was Hurricane Irma, and it resulted in heavy water throughout Pelican Preserve. Happily, we only had 1 building in which water entered the dwelling from the ground up. There were a number that had water come into them from the rain. So immediately after that, the district and this committee in ponds worked with Tetra Tech, our engineer, and Tyler's here from that, to come up with some possible solutions to how to fix it. So in the last 2 years, we have gone through a number of iterations. There's been numerous meetings. We've been working with South Florida Water Management to try and decide what to do. A number of alternatives have been presented. Some are good, some are bad, some are impractical. One option was to raise the building, to take this one building up 6 inches and take it out of the water damage. Another option was to build a berm across the rear of the pond. Another was to get forgiveness from South Florida Water Management to lower the weir in Pond 38, which is directly behind that building. Another option was to buy the building. I'm not quite sure what we were going to do with it, but we were going to buy it because that seemed to be one of the more cost-effective ways of keeping the house dry. So the long and the short of it is that we finally reached the point collectively where the district engineer said, if we're going to do this, we have to do it right, with a number of important studies, environmental studies, water flow studies, South Florida Water Management impact, and Tyler can pontificate on all the various studies. But we made a proposal to the board, which is now coming to this body today, for an authorization request of about $78,000, is that close, Tyler?
Yes.
75? $78,000 to do studies, because the various studies require quite a bit of intensive work. So, the decision, and then if we decide, if we authorize the spending of that money for the studies, then the next steps, of course, would be remediation, and that could run from 0 to probably 500,000. So the question that the board was posed was to let us deliberate whether it makes sense to spend Pelican Preserve funds for this one building. And that is kind of the decision right now. We have choices of, you know, the resident is on his own, or the 2 residents, or that HOA are on their own, or it does make sense for the community to foot the bill for the studies and then see where that takes us. So very simply, that's kind of setting the stage. We didn't want to commit that kind of money for 2 residences without a full and open discussion. And to that end, I contacted Quentin, the HOA president for Viadana, because he's certainly got a oar in the water. And without any further ado, I'll turn it over to Tyler to get into some of the particulars. The kind of things we looked at was reducing the water level in the preserve behind the community. We've learned a lot through the study. We now know we're getting a significant amount of water coming from Bridgetown. We're getting a significant amount of water coming from Arborwood. And this was relatively new information to most of us in ponds. We had no idea about this in the past. But go ahead, Tyler.
Well, good afternoon. My name is Tyler Wainwright. I'm one of the engineers at Tetra Tech. So Bob gave a pretty good background here, so I can provide, I guess, a little bit more technical insight on what's going on. So the house, or units, whatever we're referring to them as, the structure that flooded, like Bob said, is the only unit, at least that I'm aware of, in all of Gateway that had flood issues from groundwater rise anyway, not roof leaking, during that storm event 2 years ago. So let's provide some background on those storm events. So the way us engineers like to call storm events, we like to discuss them in terms of years. So there's the 5-year storm, the 25-year storm, and the 100-year storm, are your basic levels of storms. And basically what each one of them means is a 100-year storm basically has a 1% chance of happening in a year. So supposedly one should happen every 100 years. But just to prove that a lot of times we don't know what we're talking about, in that particular year, 2 100-year storms happened within 2 weeks of each other, which statistically is not impossible, and it happened to happen. If you go back and look at the rainfall records for the last 100 or so years, that was it. That was the only time that had ever actually happened in this county. So what that means is, generally structures, finished floors of structures, are designed to not flood up into the 100-year storm event. So what that means is the elevation of all of your floor slabs and this building slab and everything else in the world has to meet a minimum height, and that height is set at the 100-year floodplain. The building in question is set above the 100-year floodplain. We had it surveyed, we confirmed that. It happens to be the lowest building on the block, which is quite simply why it flooded. But it is above the 100-year floodplain. It does meet general engineering minimums for design. It just happened to be that it was the lowest one, and there were back-to-back 100-year storm events that caused it to flood. So with that in mind, we were tasked to go and look at alternatives to improve the conditions of that structure and hopefully prevent it from flooding again. Long story short is there's just not a option that is both good and cheap. It's a complex area, like Bob said, because that pond happens to receive a very large amount of flow from your neighbors to the south. That pond also conveys water into the flowway through some very large sections of piping, and that pond also is set at an elevation to keep the adjacent wetland hydrated. So originally we thought, hey, the best bang for your buck is go cut a hole inside of the structure, lower the control elevation of the lake, and that would buy you basically more time and more rain until that house floods. Well, the problem with that is now you're lowering the elevation of that lake and thereby drying out that wetland, which is not usually permissible. So we went through a back and forth of some environmental looking at and taking some wetland flaggings to see watermarks and things of that nature. Long story short, South Florida would let you do that, but they would make you basically mitigate the damage that would happen to the wetland by drying it out. So to do that, you have to go through and buy something called wetland mitigation credits. They're incredibly expensive. They're $100 and some odd $1,000 per acre, and I don't remember exactly how many acres, but it's like more than 10 that's out there. So enormous amount of money to do that. That option's essentially dead. The other option that Bob discussed was to build the berm around the lake, which basically accomplishes the same thing as lowering the control. It basically just buys you more volume and you can store more water before the house floods. There are downsides to that. Obviously there's the aesthetic point of view where all of those units along that lake are going to see a nice big 4-foot tall hill in their backyard, which some people may not find too pleasing. There's also a large cost associated with it just from the mechanics of how to do that. You got to truck in a lot of dirt, there's a lot of restoration. There's a fairly decent level of permitting to do all of that. So doable, maybe not a great option, but maybe that's the best option we have. And as Bob said, there's some, I guess, more creative options, which actually probably would be cheaper, quite frankly, like raising that building. You can absolutely do that. You can raise buildings, they do it all the time. For anybody who's familiar with it, when they put in the Metro extension, Michael G. Ritt, you know that church on the southeast corner there? They actually picked up that church because it was in the middle of the planned roadway, moved it 2 parcels next door and reset it. So moving and raising buildings is not actually as big of a deal as it sounds like. And that option, quite frankly, would be cheaper and probably more effective than what we're talking about with building this berm. But that option also has a bunch of challenges. One is that none of the parties that I'm involved with anyway own that building, so they would have to, I guess, work that out with the homeowner, and that's a whole...
It'd be 4 homeowners.
4 homeowners and mortgage companies, possibly, probably, and there's a lot of challenges with that also. The final option, which I don't know is a good option or not, but the final option is just to do nothing. And not recommending that, but the rationale of why I suppose you would do nothing is that those buildings were supposed to flood when they did. And it's unfortunate, but that's the way they were designed. So, with all of that in mind, we were tasked with putting together a proposal to Gateway to do the design, permitting, and necessary construction management services associated with doing one of those improvements. Not to raise the building, but lower the control or do the berm, basically one of those improvements. So, it's a big price tag, it's a lot of work that I don't think really anyone is excited about doing. It's a job that is quite a big undertaking for an unknown reward, I guess I should say. So the thing that I want to end with is even if you go and do those things, there's really no guarantee that the building isn't going to flood again should a larger storm or more frequent storms happen. So it'll be better, but at the end of the day, nothing's foolproof, so.
Well,
That's
one
basically
thing,
where
one
we're at.
thing I would like to add to the pond 38, that's the pond we're talking about, is at an elevation of 24 foot. Every other pond in Pelican is lower. The ponds in the rest of the Vietnam neighborhood are all at 22. And at first we thought, or we hoped that that was a mistake. But the more we dug into it, we realized it was to conserve that conservation area. So that's why it's 2 feet higher, to keep that conservation area wet. The last storm that we had, Dorian, we had teams of people on standby with sandbags at the ready. And it was our intention to sandbag that dwelling, the whole building, to prevent water from getting into the people's homes. And we talked to them, they knew we were planning to do it. As it turned out, we didn't have to do it. The storm veered away and all, but again, that is another option that's not in an engineering option, but an action plan for us is moving forward. We could take that responsibility or get the HOA, but somebody could do it, it could be done. And that is another option.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Yeah.
Even from a more permanent standpoint, from something like that line of thinking, it's pretty common for houses on the beach to install waterproofing along openings and foundations. I mean, you could look at something like that, which again would be a cheaper solution than the land solution that, you know, we're discussing. So there's a lot of other things you can do, but it all sort of involves improvements to the structure, which you
Would
know,
fall in the bailiwick of the condo rather than,
Right.
or the homeowners, rather than this body. We took the first tack that it was a ponds problem. And we've now reached the decision, or we're at the juncture that we're not sure that's really the issue.
Tyler, you said, I think, that it is at the 100-year level, or it's, so supposedly it should have withstood what happened in 2018, is that right, or was that over the
17.
Well, the
17?
so the storms that happened in 2017 were in excess of the designed 100-year storm event.
Mhm.
So that structure is pretty much at the bare minimum that it will withstand up to a 100-year event.
Mhm.
The 2 storms that we received were basically in excess of those. So the short answer is no, that they weren't designed to stay dry under those conditions.
And the cumulative effect that we couldn't get rid of the first storm before the second.
Yeah, the main problem what happened was, from an engineering standpoint, you got that long storm that basically flooded everything and backed up the 6 Mile Slough. 6 Mile Slough was full of water. Everybody was trying to dump water into 6 Mile Slough because that's where most of Lee County drains to. And it just didn't lower. It was way, way, way above control by the time Irma hit. And then when Irma hit, there was just, frankly, nowhere for the water to go.
Questions, comments?
Now, I think we at least open it up for the.
Yeah, well,
I don't have any.
Are any of the homeowners present?
Oh, yes,
Would
yeah.
you like to say something to us?
Yeah,
Okay.
if you, yes, well, I was gonna invite the
Oh, yeah.
once the board had, the committee had finished, I was gonna invite any homeowners who wanna say anything about this to come up and make their comments. I know the homeowners want to.
Yeah,
Would you please come up to the microphone and introduce yourself?
I'm Vicki Klimowicz. I'm in Unit 102 of the building that took on water. As I see it, there should be some sort of plan in action, knowing full well going into any storms now that we are vulnerable in that property. So I've heard all of the suggestions. I'm not for high-cost solutions that aren't 100% for sure that it won't happen again. But whether the homeowners association or somebody takes responsibility at the time of storms, I think is a practical good solution for us. I guess no solution or no option is not a good solution. We know we have an issue with that building. I'd like to see somebody take the responsibility for when we have storms.
Before you,
Thank you.
could I ask you a quick question? Did you have any out-of-pocket financial loss?
We replaced carpeting in the master
Okay,
bedroom.
I understand there's a lot of emotional issue
Yeah.
associated with your house flooding, and I
Yeah.
can appreciate.
And, it seeped in through the lanai, so the lanai filled up and it was coming in sliding doors is what happened, so. And just a few weeks ago, when we had higher rain totals, we could see in our backyard that pond was in our grass. It had overflowed its banks, so because it's at a higher level, you know, we're getting more water on that property.
Thank you, Vicki.
Tyler, can I ask you a question?
Yes, ma'am.
Is there any other pond that could help take care of that preserve that's close enough to, so it doesn't all have to come from 38?
That's sort of I'm trying to give a simple answer to that question. Short answer is not really. There are other ponds that help to hydrate that wetland, but if you take one out, you're still impacting it. I guess we could argue that we're not impacting it as much because there's this other pond that keeps it wet, but you'd still be on the hook for some amount of mitigation. And part of the problem with that solution is you don't know how many mitigation credits that the Water Management District is going to make you buy until you go through the effort of doing the design and saying, okay, we're gonna make it this much lower, it's gonna be this much drier, and then they have to go out and evaluate the wetland. And good news, bad news is the wetland's pretty healthy, so it scores pretty high, so they make you buy more, and it's all sort of a long story.
Nancy, also to help on that answer, there are at least 5 ponds on the Bridgetown side that could take water from our perspective, selfishly, from our perspective. It could be channeled in that direction. We did have South Florida come out and investigate, not measure, but investigate the presence of the berm that is supposed to be on the Bridgetown side that would prevent their water from coming to us. And as far as we got in that meeting, were you and I together in that last one? As far as we got is they said they would go look at it. And they did, and they said, yeah, they see a berm. I've looked at it with Mr. Tinkle from the board, and okay, there might be a little hump in the grass, but there's certainly not a berm in the sense that I'm used to seeing. But we can't force them, Bridgetown, to do this. We can work with South Florida and advocate, but up to now, they have not been very receptive at all. They don't look like it's a big problem.
Well, whatever we decide today, I don't think that option should be abandoned. I think there ought to be pressure kept on Bridgetown, and on Arborwood. if it's
Well,
coming from
I'm not
Arborwood.
absolutely sure Bridgetown is even aware of it, to be honest with you, because we've been dealing with South Florida. We had to get special permission to even get in there and look at it. I don't know if we've made inquiries to Bridgetown per se.
We haven't had any direct contact with Bridgetown. I know their design engineer pretty well, and I've had conversations with them. And they're not in a negative way, but I mean, their standpoint is basically we're doing more or less what we're permitted to do.
And that's exactly correct. And they had no problems like we did with flooding, none.
So it's coming.
Tyler, I have a question. From an engineering standpoint and from past history, I've worked on a couple projects that had to do with water levels and water flow. One happens to be the Riverwalk in San Antonio, which I'm sure everyone is aware of. They have a water source, and they have a dam system, and they have a float system, and the floats control the level of that river. And it sends signals back to equipment that my company supplied, actually, that readjust the dam so that the level is maintained on the river, regardless of what the source is. But they have a float system that enables them to open and close dams. Why can't we put some sort of a float system on that lake and have an adjustable weir that when the level starts to go up, the weir would automatically lower to keep the level where it's supposed to be, which meets the state's and the engineering specifications of 24 feet, and just let that water escape. Now we're not damaging the environment, we're keeping the level where it's supposed to be, and I don't think that will be terribly expensive to do. There's electromechanical valve actuators available that you can buy to open and close dams, and they have such sophisticated electronics today. I think you could electronically control the level of that lake and minimize your expense. And
Joe, that is being pursued, not specifically to the pond, but to all gateway water and to have adjustability in our weirs. But that's a separate initiative unrelated to Help 38. But that is being done. There's $130,000 study
So.
that they're doing for all of Gateway on hydraulics.
So, a couple of things. That example is kind of funny because we actually designed that system that you're discussing for river water. That was a Tetra Tech project out of San
When
Antonio.
you bought my equipment, thank you.
You're welcome. So I'm familiar with it. I know what you're talking about. Yeah, you can do that. You could add operable sluice gates onto the control structure, and you could have liquid level controls so that when the water stage is up higher than 24, that sluice gate opens beneath that to add excess flow downstream into the flowway. Yeah, you could do that. I personally think that the only drawback to that is, well, there's, I guess, a couple things that should be discussed if that's going to be considered. Number one, you got to basically put that water somewhere. And the problem in the example of when the house flooded is that you can open that gate all you want, and there was nowhere for the water to go. It, in fact, actually would have gone backwards in the other way had you had something like that in place. You know, if it's an isolated event and it's just a short rainstorm that's, you know, in our general area, yeah, it would work great. But I get back to, you know, it solves a problem. It's not, you know, it's not a guarantee. I mean, it's not a, like, I guess what I'm trying to say is if what happened in 2017 happened again, it would still flood.
South Florida was not interested in anything that would take our water and further degrade the communities downstream. They flat out told us that we can't negatively impact somebody else.
But if the water's flooding already, it's still going over someplace, and it's impacting those communities
All I'm
downstream.
telling you, it's not up to us. We can't do the weird changes without South Florida approval, and they're not inclined right now to do that. We're hoping that study, we might make a much better case. That's why we're doing it.
So the broader study that Bob's referring to is something that is sort of community-wide that we had been in contact with South Florida about, which is installing operable weir gates on all of the weirs that are currently fixed. And that would allow you to basically do what you're talking about. They asked us to put together an hydraulic analysis that more or less proves that we're not going to flood the guy downstream by doing so, which we think we can prove in. And it's helpful, it's good, it'll improve the situation.
Another question then, what is the flood stage of that pond? If the level is 26 feet, is the flood stage 27, or 24, I'm sorry. If the flood stage 25 feet or 27 feet, where was it? How much water can it absorb before you have to release anything?
I don't have the exact number, but it's more or less 2 feet. It's pretty close to 2 feet.
So it seems to me then maybe an argument might be that if you had an automatic controlled damper system there, when the water gets up to a certain point, you're still holding it, and then you can start releasing it in minimum quantities without having a huge impact downstream. That would at least reduce the opportunity for flooding for these units.
It's doable. I'm with you, it's doable. You're gonna have to get some gateway buy-in, or somebody buy-in, because there's some O&M with, now you have operable devices. There's some controls that would need to be put in place. There's level floats that would need to be maintained. I mean, there's just ancillary stuff that's gonna happen if
Yeah.
you go that route, but yeah, it's doable.
But that's bigger than the issue we're talking about now. That's-
That's a gateway wide issue.
Bob, the question, could South Florida, were they so inclined, could they force Bridgetown to do something on their side?
I think they have the power to do it,
Mhm.
whether they, I don't know what the politics are. Or,
Mm-hmm.
you know, again, they're looking at everything from a macro level, things that were developed in the 90s. And we gotta give them a really good reason why we wanna change something that won't impact anybody else. Quite honestly, I haven't seen a lot of flexibility. I have a lot of sympathy from them with no concrete suggestions. And in all honesty, a lot of the things that we looked at, we talked about alternate spillways and other things. But there was no certainty from the engineering group that even if we spent the money, it would work. I mean, even the berm we're talking about, we're not even sure it would work.
The berm.
If we decided to build the berm between us and Bridgetown,
Yeah.
whether it would actually work or not, we don't.
And it's gonna cost money if
you build a berm, we build it or they build it, it costs.
Somebody's gonna spend a lot of money to do something without a certainty that that resolves the issue.
Sure, I mean, I guess the big scale picture here is that anything that is done is going to cost some amount of money. Some of these are gonna cost a lot of money. And at the end of the day, my engineering opinion that I'm gonna give you is that had that same event repeated itself, which, you know, statistically shouldn't happen, but it did anyway, I'm not gonna tell you that it's not gonna flood again, because it might.
Could you give us an idea, how would you waterproof those buildings without putting berms or anything else? How would you waterproof them?
There's a bunch of options that people sell, but one of them is basically you put tracks, sort of like hurricane shutter tracks, on the outside of all the openings, and then should a storm come, just like when you go out and put hurricane shutters up, there's gasketed big pieces of stainless that you slide into place, and you drop them into place, and it waterproofs the opening. They're pretty simple, really. They're flood panels.
But that's a homeowner issue as opposed to.
Yes, ma'am, and I guess, you know, that's part of the problem is, you know, I actually think that issue of preventing water entering the structure could be done for a boatload cheaper money, but it's, I guess, homeowner money, not HOA or gateway money, unless HOA gateway decides to pay for that, and that's where it gets complicated.
I mean, what we're seeing is, we had, our first storm was the remnants from Harvey. Harvey sat on Houston for a long time. Dorian just sat on top of Bahamas for a long time. Those are different. Those are Category 5 storms that we haven't seen the likes of before. So our storms are getting stronger. It just depends on where they hit and where they sit. So somehow there needs to be something that helps.
Yeah, so, I mean, you know, big picture wise, there actually is changes happening right now in the way that engineers design stormwater based on environmental factors that change over the years. I mean, exactly as you said, I mean, you can prove from data that storms have been more intense over the last 10, 20 years compared to the last 100, which is currently, you know, the field of design, right? And, you know, things change and we use higher numbers for storm events now, but that building is already designed and it's already in the ground, and, you know, we're discussing changes to that now. And the problem with trying to do something from a South Florida standpoint, or from a permitting standpoint, right or wrong, they're gonna tell you, you know, unfortunately, yeah, it flooded, but it met the minimum standards. And, you know, while it's unfortunate to flood, and I wouldn't want to flood, my house did flood in the hurricane, but that's a whole separate story. That the minimum standards were met, and there's got to be some level that things are designed to. I mean, it can't be, you know, designed for Hurricane Harvey where 40 inches of rain got dumped. I mean, that's just not practical to design to. There's got to be some level where the cutoff happens, and that's where that building is at.
Well, Bob or Tyler, you wanna make a comment?
Yeah, please, if I
Come
could.
on up.
Hi, my name is Ron Sichdowski. I'm a 10651 across from where Vicky is, and my building was not affected in many ways. I did walk before the hurricane. I actually walked during the hurricane, which wasn't the smartest thing, and after the hurricane, okay? So there are things that evolved there. Immediately, the drainage system in Viadana was right at ground level. It never drained, okay? My concern is, it was clean, it got a little better, but if you go today, it's not that much below the grate that sits there. Now it seems to be worse because you got Plaza that just finished 5 buildings. Where's the water going? I could watch the Bridgetown water coming from someplace. I don't know where it comes from. You actually see it going down the drain in the system. It's going into pond, lake or pond. I'm not sure which that is actually. I've heard lake, but and that's adding to that process. So are the 4 or 5 buildings they completed. Last time we had a kayak going down the middle of the street, and that's the truth.
We did too.
All right, and you know, and the water not only went, there's a big stream that occurs, or a lake, or whatever you want to call it, behind where it is now. It went all the way down and filled the other pond, and it started coming back on the south side. There were a lot of buildings that had water right onto their lanai. Didn't go in, but they were on the lanai. As you add more and more stuff where the water's flowing, the concern I have is what is it gonna do to that whole south side community? And it may be more than one building, it may be 5, it may be 6, you know, and it was really close, and I think it's a concern we have to take a look at. I can say that I was at Dee's place, and the water was right up to her lanai, because she asked me to do some stuff or whatever it was, right afterwards. All right, the building that was next to the building we're talking about had water right up into that position. On this storm was mentioned, the water was coming up on the grass well before there was supposed to be the hurricane. What happens when that occurs? I think this is a much bigger issue. As I look at it, walking around and going through it, I agree. I don't know that berm's gonna do very much either, but I think that there's some real issues that sit there. And I think it sits for that whole south side of everybody who sits to that pond. And I don't know, the water came up to the driveway. It didn't come into the garages, but it came all the way up to the driveway, not only killing the plants, but there was water that were not very far from going to the downstairs garages. You know, those are the kinds of things that are there in reality, I believe.
Ron, I'm gonna ask Tyler maybe to step up with his expertise, but as I recall, there were a lot of number of engineering studies after those storms. And one of the conclusions, and I'll ask Tyler to confirm it, that at least I walked away with, was that the Pelican Preserve met the design flood standards, which included our streets and our yards as being part of the floodplain. And as long as the water only came up to the door and didn't come in, it met the design specifications that South Florida Water Management or whoever put those together. So we were, I mean, you were walking out, you were in water, but that was the design acceptance, so there's nothing any of us could do. I mean, one of the complaints we heard was you couldn't drive down the streets because they were full of water, but that was not an issue from an engineering standpoint. So Tyler, maybe you could express a little more expertise on that.
Yeah, so I guess back to the very beginning of the conversation, you know, I said there's different levels of storms that things are designed to. Houses are designed to the 100-year flood. Perimeter berms on communities are designed to the 25-year flood. Roadways, anybody want to take a guess? How many years? 5 years. So there's a number of reasons for that. One is because developers pay lobbyists quite a bit of money, and number two is actually a good reason. You want to put the water somewhere. The water has to go somewhere. If you build everything up, the water's still going to go somewhere. It's just going to go somewhere else. So what you try to do in design is that you try to keep the water somewhere that's not habitable. And streets serve two purposes. One, they're not habitable. Yeah, it's not great that you can't drive down the road, but it's not in a house, which is good. And two, it actually helps convey the water out of the community. So, and how you do design, the streets actually end up being your conveyance in the 5-year storm events. But that's how streets are designed. Streets are designed to flood in the 5-year storm.
Ron, to your comment about, you know, how deep the water was in the south part,
Yes.
specifically Palazzo and Vietnam, that's very, very true. If we had a gathering of neighbors from Verona, Bella Vista, or Bellagio, you'd hear the very same thing. Although they didn't get wet inside, they were every bit as deep as what we were out in the southern portion.
I agree with that. My point is though, is when you look at the lawns, they were encroaching, you know.
Absolutely, I don't
And
disagree
they're
with
not
that
very
at all.
far from being in their homes either.
That is exactly right. He got very, very close. I saw a lot of garage doors that were sandbagged, and appropriately so, although, you know, didn't quite get that far.
And a, you know, kind of related comment, if we go ahead and do something, are we setting some kind of a precedent that there are other near flooding homes that, you know, 2 or 3 or 5 years down the road, we're gonna be trying to come up with a solution for those?
I guess we need some kind of, you know, guidance from Tony, but,
Yeah,
yeah, there is the precedent establishment in the allocation of funds. The ponds work group is not gonna get off of this regardless of what we do, you know, money-wise. We're still gonna do every possible thing we can. And in the future, we will still be sandbagging. And now we'll be looking at possibly some of these mitigation efforts by building dams. I don't say we're gonna bear the burden of the price for that, but we'll do the studies in any way we can be helpful.
I'd just like to tell the audience, Bob referenced Tony. Tony is our attorney.
Bob, one of the things that, fortunately, ponds had done just before Irma was done their check of the drainage system, and I know you're on top of that.
Yeah,
Every year.
for the residents, whether you know it or not, every single pipe and every catch basin is inspected yearly, or by 3 years, every 3 years. And we had just completed the last cycle before this hit in 17, but we inspect everything. We do a third, in order to keep our costs down, inspect and clean. Yeah.
And clean as
Expect and clean as appropriate. And our cleaning threshold is about 25%. Once an area has a collection of debris greater than 25%, we prioritize and cleaning on that basis.
I have one other thought I was thinking of. Is there any chance to put in a pumping system and pump that water somewhere else? I mean, other ponds are flooding, but even pumping, the other ponds are all interconnected. So if we could pump water into another pond, it would kind of settle out around the whole community. Would that help alleviate the problem?
Kind of. You get back to the same sort of problem. You know, if it's not raining, pump's fantastic. When it is raining, Bridgetown is permitted. I should say it's just Bridgetown. It's Bridgetown and Pelican, which contributes flow into that pond. There's roughly like 50 CFS going into that pond, 50 cubic feet per second, which is a tremendous amount of water. 50 cubic feet per second is like almost the size of a room every second with water. It's a huge amount of water. And the short answer is it would be a really, really big pump to keep up with that.
And if we did it, Joe, just thinking out of the box, but if you did it, that means you're lowering the 24 design, or the 22 design. The 24 design, you're dropping it down because you're pumping out.
Well, you wouldn't be lowering it because it's already
If
flooding.
you're pumping water out, you're lowering something.
Well, yeah, but you're not lowering it below the
And
24
that could
feet.
impact the wetland again.
Let them prove it.
We gotta have a place to put the water though.
Yeah. Tyler,
That's the issue.
the plan that the CDD is asking us to endorse, which is to do the engineering for which one of these mitigating, to do what?
I think it's the berm option that is currently proposed.
All the components of doing that require environmental studies and all these other, so no matter which one of the various options you choose, they would need these legs to hold the stool.
Okay, so
it's
most of that,
most of the money
most of that
is to
engineering
support whatever.
we finally decide to
Yeah.
do.
So at this point in time, we're just going to approve the study and at a later date decide who's responsible for the actual repairs or changes?
Well, if we go that far.
That's a route we could go. And would Bob, or Tyler, would the engineering studies direct us toward one particular ones of these solutions?
Yeah, I mean, we would end up giving you a recommendation on what to do. I'll just throw this out there, that the amount of money that is being talked about for just this design phase is more than what it would cost to retrofit the structure. And we're not even talking about construction of the improvements that would come from that design phase.
When you say retrofit the structure?
Adding floodproofing, raising it, things like that. So, you know, I can't tell you or anyone else to spend that money, but I'm just throwing it out there that
It's a lot of money.
you can fix the house for less than you're gonna pay for
It's
this.
important to know the options, that's exactly
So,
right.
are you saying it would cost less to raise the building than to do the study?
I don't know about raising the building, pretty close probably, but floodproofing with flood barriers, yeah, it'd be a lot less. So,
Bob, do we,
something to consider.
do we know from Tony, legally who has this responsibility, or is it unclear?
No, we've taken it upon ourselves at ponds. We haven't asked for any type of, answer to that. The only thing I pursued with Tony was there somebody we could sue? Oh, I'm serious, was the building built properly? Was there something flawed in the way they interpreted the rules or all that? And I guess the bottom line is that even though the dog don't like the dog food, everybody did it right, but the building is still so vitally close. It's not defective, but it sure could have been a whole lot safer. All the other buildings that were other groups, if you think of Viadana, as going towards Palazzo, everything on the left-hand side of the road and everything on the right-hand side up to the golf cart path were at a certain level. And these 4 or 5 buildings were at a lesser level as a group.
Mhm.
But they met the requirement.
But different engineering, correct me if I'm saying it wrong, because I'm saying what I think I've heard, but the engineering requirements and the companies that did the first 3/4 of that was Company A, and then Company B finished it up.
There's, one of the reasons why we're still talking about this 2 years later is there's a tremendous amount of backstory with companies that are out of business and companies that are in business and companies that acquired those companies that are out of business and things of that nature. But long story short is, it could have and probably was supposed to be a little bit different. But regardless of all of that, the end of the story is that it's above the minimum. which
So
is
we
where we're at.
pursued that legally, and I tried to see if there was somebody we could go after, and the long and the short of it is it'd probably be an effort in futility, because they still met that minimum.
Well, it sounds to me as though there's the solution that somehow the CDD might pay for, which would be a berm or something of that sort. Then there's the solution that the homeowners or the association would have to pay for, which would be waterproofing the homes. You're talking about as a less expensive alternative. Seems to me it would be worthwhile pursuing with Tony, you know, legally, where do we sit? Do we, you know, not who we can sue, but who does the arrow point at, the legal arrow point at? Does it point at the CDD and our doing the work, or does it point at the homeowners and they're doing the work? Because if indeed it is the homeowners who should do the work, and I'm sorry to be saying that in front of these folks, it seems to me that that's, you know, certainly for us is a cheaper alternative, and in total, you're saying it's probably a cheaper alternative, that we ought to at least pursue that to find out, you know, where we stand legally.
Okay, we can do that. And the other thing is, can we legally make an exception to the general rule and apply whatever fix we think we might want to apply without precedent for
Yeah.
future actions?
Right.
May I say something?
Yeah, please.
Vicki Clemwich again. My only thought as I'm hearing the discussion is this type of property that we have, we are responsible for the walls in. Everything outside is not part of our maintenance. And our problem is outside. It's not inside the building.
Yeah, this
So-
is a condo association.
It's a
So
condo.
our vernacular is not,
Yeah.
it's not really the homeowner, we're talking to condo.
It's the association.
It's the
Okay.
association,
It's
yeah.
the association.
But good clarification, you're absolutely
Thank
right.
you. Go ahead.
See if there's any other comments from the audience, folks that are here. Anybody else would like to say something on this issue? Okay. I'm having a hard time personally justifying even the study of $78,000 to $80,000. When, from what I'm hearing, is that most of the solutions will be several hundreds of thousands of dollars. And then when you get to that kind of a number, I'm having a hard time justifying putting out that kind of money. If the issues associated with that one building. Okay? So I don't know.
That's what we're talking
That's
about.
what we're talking about.
We were having this, we were choking on the same thing.
Yeah, yeah. Quentin, you wanna make a comment here?
Yes. Quentin Davis, president of the Adana Condominium Association. I've been working with Bob for 2 years.
2 years.
Actually, a little longer than that, but 2 years on this issue. There's multiple, as you've seen, related issues. One of the things you haven't talked about today is that as the storm events of 2017 came about, not only did we have flooding, but we also lost power. We lost power because of our power provider, Florida Power and Light, built their transformer box a foot too low and will not correct that. They told us that prayer is the best answer because when Palazzo and Bridgetown are finished, there'll be a redundant electric ring and we'll get our electricity if that one box floods out from a different source.
I've responded that prayer is not an appropriate response for a condominium association. It may help, but it's not the response we want. I would like to keep the pressure up on you, quite frankly, to address this issue. There's actually 4 units involved, 2 down, 2 up. And why it was built as low as it is, I have no idea. For clarification, Via Donna was built in about 4 phases. Okay? The north side and the first 2 buildings on the south side were built in 2007. Then a couple more were built post bankruptcy. Then a couple more, and then the final 5, of which this building is 1. And they were built by multiple contractors. Quality control was not what we would like to have seen, but that's something we didn't have any control over at the time. One of the things that I've been following over in Miami is the impact of climate change. You talked about their 200-year events in 2 weeks. Climate change is real, and Miami is dealing with the king floods, the king tides that are coming in over there. They're going to lose a part of Miami. You're having gentrification due to water level rise in Miami, change of property values. So this is something we have to address. I do have a question. If the CDD were to buy the building or to raise the building,